Absolutely enormous guard previews today. We've got infantry squads that go up to 20 men in size, the new system of orders and born soldiers, send in the next wave returns to swap command points for entire extra units returned to the board, and the new profile for the Baneblade, which is looking remarkably tough with very easy to access cover. Let's talk Imperial Guard in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Astra Militarum, and Games Workshop has given us a spectacularly generous preview with the new Guard rules here. I'd say they've perhaps answered more questions for the Guard than they have about a fair few other factions in the game so far. We basically have both of their main special rules, the normal few extra weapon profiles and stratagems and datasheets, but also a couple of their enhancements as well. Going through the big reveal drop today, first up we've got the Voice of Command being the new faction rule. This is basically the Imperial Guard order system, and this is the one that they'll get no matter what detachment they're playing with. The new system has orders that work the same for vehicles and infantry, so it's a bit slimmed down as with just about everything in 10th edition, but still seems very serviceable. The launch detachment that Guard get is called the Combined Regiment, and that looks like the one that they'll have for quite a while as their codex isn't imminently on the horizon. The special rule for this one is Born Soldiers. Basically works kind of similar with lethal hits on ranged hits, but you have to be stationary. We've then got the reveals of about 5 different rules, or at least partial reveals. There's the new Battle Cannon profile, though it does seem worse to me unfortunately. GW like to show off their big scary anti-tank weapons, so we get the Volcano Cannon for Guard today. Perhaps one of the most interesting and fun bits of the preview, which is a reinforcement stratagem to throw extra men into the fight. I feel like this one will be very popular. And then 2 enhancements for your warlords and things, the Death Mask of Alanius, plus a drill leadership type one. Then to showcase a few of the rules on some actual units, we've got the new datasheets for Cadian shock troops, now most notably available in squads of 20, whereas previously you'd usually have 10, and then the profile for the mighty Baneblade. The most striking thing about that for me seems that it's going to be super tough with very easy cover to get, very nice with 10th edition's reduced AP. There's a whole ton to dig into here, so let's go through it bit by bit. First up we've got Voice of Command, and I think it would have been kinda disappointing if Games Workshop removed orders from the Guard. Due to having 6 different orders on the special rule, it does seem a bit more in depth than quite a lot of the faction rules that other armies are getting. The orders list has been rejigged a bit, and there has been a little bit of change in the style of how they're handed out, but I'd broadly say that there's more similarities than differences. First up, the orders seem to still happen in the command phase, which is the same as currently. I'd hope that there might be some sort of workaround for units like Scions arriving from Deep Strike with then Tempesta Primes, or units getting out of transport. Doesn't appear that there are on this. I guess it's not impossible that there might be something on certain HQ datasheets though. Otherwise I guess it could be quite a lot weaker for units getting out of transports and things. As before, it looks like the Voice of Command only goes out to 6-inch range. It says that you select one eligible unit within 6 inches of your officer, but due to it happening in the command phase, it means you'd have to think about that range when you actually move the squad, so make sure your formations keep together. Looks like it's not limited to just the units that your leaders are leading. Means that it might be a little bit more flexible than certain other buffs like say Space Marines lieutenants and things. They seem to be just locked to the squad that they join. I'd guess that as before, the Master Vox on the command squad would probably increase that range somehow. We don't know the full rules on that, but apparently the command squad sounds like it will still act as a leader, so able to join a big infantry squad. Games Workshop mentioned that these orders would be handed out to the units that were dictated by the individual HQ datasheets. They both mentioned the Cadian Castellans handing it out to infantry, and then also mentioned tank commanders ordering vehicles around. So it sounds like compared with the previous multiple trees of orders, these ones will just apply to all the units that get ordered, including vehicles. I feel like by its nature that is going to mean that some of the orders are just going to be stronger on vehicles or on infantry, and from the wording that they use it sounds like it's going to be handed out by the platoon and squadron keywords, much as it was before. They say that Lord Solar is still going to basically be able to order everyone, so he's still going to be super flexible. I'd guess that units like Auxilia and Ogrins and things will probably be largely excluded. Maybe Mr. Leontus will still be able to whisper to them in a special way though. We don't get the exact numbers that each officer can order, it's going to vary datasheet on datasheet. Wouldn't be too surprised to see something similar to how we have now, with perhaps 2 off the Castellan, 1 off the command squad. From this preview at least, it looks like we don't have any sort of appearance of the splash effect rule from 9th. I think we might be going back to the system where we just had 1 order per unit. Not terrible, and that was how it worked previously, but might just mean that you can't rely on 1 officer to splash 1 order to an entire formation. Finally, it does look like there's one more downside built into orders now, and this is now that they're affected by battle shock, whereas if your unit suffers battle shock, then this will cancel them. It's really quite a big deal of battle shock, to be honest, and I feel like battle shock is already one of the rules that might have hit Guard a bit more than most. Looks like, as suspected, their base leadership is a leadership 7+, so it means that they'll usually have a 40% chance to fail it whenever they're testing. That's already going to be kind of painful with the downsides to falling back and holding objectives and things, never mind cancelling their faction ability as well. Definitely could be a bit of a weakness and might make orders just a little bit less reliable than they were before. I feel like this is perhaps a fairly fluffy faction specific weakness though, as if your unit's running away it's unlikely to be affected by orders or too bothered about what the man in the fancy hat will tell them. The fact that this is a thing could certainly make commissars a bit more relevant, I suppose. We haven't seen the new rules for these guys yet. It might be that we actually see them return as a model that does something useful in terms of morale mechanics, as opposed to in 9th edition with giving some other fancy orders and morale just being their side thing. Overall, perhaps a few tweaks here. I wouldn't say any enormous changes. It does seem that most of the changes are on the negative side of things. Perhaps a few more restrictions than there were before, but still, given everything is getting completely rebalanced in 10th edition anyway, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to work out as bad news for the Guard overall. Besides how they're handed out, we do actually have the details of the actual orders themselves. Compared with previously, these are quite close to the regiment style orders that we had, the ones issued by the standard officers. Move, move, move is a nice simple 3 inches buff to your movement now. Not quite as potent as the one where it gave you extra movement when you advanced to. I guess in theory it maxes out at a 15-inch move if you roll a 6 on your advance, but on average it's a tiny bit less and a little bit less reliable. Still seems pretty great though and very useful. Really good if you need to get to an objective in a hurry, or there's just no damage dealing to be done this turn, so you may as well position optimally. Could be kind of nice for line of sight for Russes as well if it's going to make a critical difference. It doesn't stop you firing or anything. Fixed bayonets gives you a +1 to your weapon skill in combat. Given the Guard unit pool, I think it's going to be unlikely to be particularly good for most units bar Rough Riders. If their weapon profile stays anywhere close to what it is at the moment, then getting them to hit better in melee would be very nice. If Ogrin and Borgrin can use it as well, then that would be awesome. Will be interesting to see how restrictive they are with the Auxilia in terms of which units you can target. +1 to hit with Borgrin does seem pretty good if it's achievable. Perhaps the single most useful one though, I think is still likely to be Take Aim. This one's now just a +1 to your ballistic skill at range. It doesn't give you extra AP anymore, so won't make your lasguns more savage. Again, a definite tone down from the 9th Codex, but not really going back all that far, and it's still a massive damage boost. It does seem that they're trying to be a bit more restrictive with how much AP they get into this edition, and I feel like giving lasguns AP -1 probably wasn't helping with that whole trend. It's kind of helpful that this modifies the ballistic skill and not the hit roll. That could be pretty important. If modifiers still don't stack, it means that you could still have modifiers on top of this to have your guardsmen hitting on a potential 2+, I suppose. I think it is likely to be a staple, getting things like Lehman Russes and field ordnance batteries to be hitting on a 3+. Maybe this is one that's particularly exciting on vehicles as opposed to just infantry. Next up, first rank fire, second rank fire has seen another minor change. This one's been altered so it now just gives you a +1 attack to rapid fire weapons. Most notably that's going to be lasguns, hotshot lasguns and plasma guns. I feel like that's going to be particularly interesting on plasma guns, so if you're planning on using this in any big way, it's worth having one of them as a special weapon. Take aim is usually going to be a 33% increase in damage going from 4s to 3s. This however is going to be a lot better, plus 100% damage at long range or plus 50% damage at half range. If the majority of your weapons in the unit are rapid fire weapons, then this is going to be better. Seems pretty exciting on things like Scions, Kazakin, or your standard infantry units. If you just need opportunistic more damage dealing, then this is going to be better than Take Aim for quite a few units. Take Cover returns as well, and this one's the defensive one. This one gives you a +1 to your save characteristic, improving it to a maximum of 3+. Again, like the Take Aim one, this isn't actually a modifier to your save, and despite the name it doesn't give them the benefit of cover or anything like that, so I guess in theory this does stack with cover for the vast majority of units. Say if you had a guardsman on a 5+ save go to a 4+, you'd be able to get a 3+ if you also had cover as well. I think for Scions and things in cover though, it wouldn't quite stack due to that exemption in the new cover rules where you can't go from a 3+ to a 2+ save. That just stays as is. The cap on 3+ saves does mean it's less likely to impact vehicles as well. I'd guess that most of the guard motor pool will still be having a 3+ or a 2+ save. I guess could be handy on scout sentinels maybe, and just seems generally pretty useful. Again, if you've got no real damage dealing to be doing, you've already got fairly good mobility, and you just need to hold a point at all costs. Finally, we've got a leadership and objective one called Duty and Honor. This one gives you unit plus 1 objective control and 1 extra leadership. And the first thing that strikes me about this one is that it'll happen in the command phase before you score objectives, so potentially this could be a trick that you could use to suddenly gain objective control on a point and potentially sweep the point away from your opponent at the last second. Seems basically auto-include if you can just trade it for victory points like that, otherwise it'll be a little bit more questionable unless your opponent's got some really nice battle shock type tricks when maybe it could be necessary. I'd guess that most of the time you're probably going to be better off with some of the various damage or defensive tricks, but it does seem like quite an intimidating prospect to say park 20 Cadian shock troops on an objective, give them all plus 1 objective control, and then in theory you've got 60 points on that objective. It's not going to go anywhere fast even if your opponent kills a whole bunch of them. Overall, I feel like it's a pretty solid order tree there. None of them look entirely useless. I'd guess probably fixed bayonets is going to be the most niche unless Borgren gets super good and they're very easy to target with it. Otherwise I'd say that probably take aim is going to be the staple, particularly on things like Rosses, and everything else will have its place at the right time and the right unit. Combined with that, as mentioned, we get Born Soldiers. This one's the detachment specific special rule for the combined regiments. That's the detachment that the Guard are going to be getting at launch. We don't have a full text preview for this one like we did with the orders, but they did basically go through it in their free text. Essentially it's going to mean that the entire Guard army will get lethal hits, so 6s to hit auto wound, provided the unit in question remains stationary. Basically it does mean that the vast majority of your Guard force can access auto wounding on 6s if it needs to, though I do feel that this is really quite a big nerf compared with 9th edition. Remaining stationary is a pretty enormous downside for a lot of units quite a bit of the time, and a lot of the time it's just not going to be worth remaining stationary to access this kind of damage buff. I think on a lot of units it still is going to be pretty relevant, particularly things like artillery and mortars, which you'd expect would normally not need to move anyway, as it's going to be hiding out of line of sight and in range of most things, and then basically anything else that's really quite happy sitting out in the open, giving and receiving blows. Things like certain tanks and vehicles like Rosses or Baneblades and stuff, they seem fairly plausible to use this on. When the enemy counterattacks as well, and just some of your infantry find themselves in a good position to repel the foe, again this really could come in clutch, but even then I feel like repositioning, getting your squads onto objectives, or getting them in better range, probably still is going to be very tempting. Just typically in 40k it's just kind of rare these days that you really want your units to be completely standing still. They need to be moving up to objectives, getting line of sight, maybe move blocking or staying safe from the enemy depending on when they can charge, and just getting auto wounds on 6s I don't think is quite enough to outweigh that for really quite a lot of the models that you might have. The buff's going to be most relevant on relatively weak stuff, targeting relatively tough stuff. It will be a very nice thing to have, particularly against armies like Knights, where the auto wounds will really punch through. It's maybe a rule that you could think about using a bit more in certain matchups more than others. Obviously we don't have the full Guard Codex yet, so there might well be other good synergies that could really make this work a lot better. There's a character enhancement that allows you to proxy this on a 5 or a 6, which is significantly more powerful, and there might well be units in the army that allow you full rerolls to hit, or counts as stationary maybe. Either of those, as with now, could make it massively more powerful and get you far more auto wounds to drown your foe and saves. Overall I would say that this is definitely a fair bit weaker than the prior version, but still very handy to have against tough stuff. Just being able to play a bit differently and basically have your entire army suddenly flex into lethal hits for a turn could be absolutely critical against some really tough units. Next up, and with this preview I'd perhaps argue one of the most disappointing things that I've seen, is the new profile for the Lehman Russ Battle Cannon. Arguably the army-wide special rules have been toned down a bit, but given that 10th edition is reducing the lethality quite a lot, that might not be the worst, but from first take at least it just seems that the mainline battle cannon for the Imperial Guard just doesn't look all that efficient, even if it's pointed cheaply. The battle cannon retains the d6 plus 3 shots profile and has the blast keyword, so to get a few more shots against hordes. Previously it was at strength 8, AP minus 2 and damage 3, and I think it did the job at being quite a good all-rounder. It also had the turret weapon rule, which allowed it to hit on 3s. It seems that at least the base profile for this thing still hits on 4s though now. It's not impossible that we might get a turret weapon special rule on the datasheet, but it looks like for the Baneblade equivalents that's not the case, so there's at least a reasonable chance that the Rosses aren't going to get one either. Otherwise though, for the gun profile it seems to be largely fairly bad news. It's down to 48-inch range now, though admittedly that still will hit most things on the board. And the new profile for the gun is strength 10, AP minus 1 and damage 3. Strength 10 sounds like it's an improvement, but I'd argue it's probably not actually in the context of 10th edition. It looks like the majority of vehicles are going to be somewhere between toughness 9 and toughness 12, with only a few tough things like certain super heavies being higher than that. Strength 10 to me just feels a little bit on the low side for going into most vehicles. You're going to be wounding things like repulsors or land raiders on a 5+ rather than a 4, and I feel like the AP is pretty killer on top of that. Even things with just a 3+ save and no invul are still going to be saving you on a 4+, which just seems very unreliable altogether, never mind if they get cover or something. Unless this has got access to some serious buffs like grinding advance or turret weapon on its datasheet, it just looks like a very weedy gun altogether. Doesn't quite average a dead Terminator each time it fires, only averages around about 1 failed save to a Rhino tank, so about 3 wounds with a shot there, and about half that to a repulsor wounding it on 5s, only 1 failed save per 2 rounds of shooting. Pretty grim, and it's not going to make a mark against that very much. I'm really hoping that the datasheet rule will kind of turn this around, as I feel like even with a super cheap points cost this really isn't likely to be any good, and it would be a shame to have the generic battle cannon outclassed by quite this much. I guess this is only one gun out of many Lehman Russ turrets though, hopefully the rest will provide something a bit more useful. It does look like the Demolisher could be kind of interesting if it mirrors the one on the Baneblade profile. Otherwise for Russes, I kind of suspect that they will get some other damage buff on their datasheet. Hopefully it's powerful enough to make this meaningful. Otherwise I think it's going to be very dependent on tank commanders giving it a 3+ to hit. 4+ to hit on your mainline damage dealers is just kind of fragile to modifiers, and a -1 to hit could cut your damage even further. The other gun that we've had previewed is the new Volcano Cannon for the Shadow Sword. Previously this one was D3 plus 3 shots at strength 18, AP 5 and damage 12. It hit on 3+ with a turret weapon, though it has seen some changes like the Ross. Now you're only averaging 3 shots rather than 5. These are made at a whopping strength 24, AP 5 and damage 12, hitting on a 3+ when static or 4+ when moving due to the heavy keyword. Again, it does seem to be following the 10th edition trend of less damage output overall, this quite significantly. Though still, to be honest, this is one of the few guns that is still going to be able to effortlessly swat aside tanks if you do fail a save or two. The low number of shots means that it's kind of bad against anything with an invul save, will be very hit or miss as to whether or not it actually punches through. But otherwise against literally every vehicle that's not got an invul save, that's toughness 12 or less, that's going to average you 1.6 failed saves per turn. Usually either 12 wounds or 24 wounds on your targets depending on how lucky you get. It still looks like you're odds on to end a repulsor or a land raider in a single shot, perhaps more so if you can spare a CP to reroll a wound roll or something. Still certainly looks terrifyingly scary, and we do have some rules for the Baneblade chassis shown off later. Certainly looks like it won't be something that's easy to remove from the table. Next up, and perhaps one of the single most fun rules out of this entire preview, is send in the next wave. I feel like a lot of the other things have arguably been nerfs for the Guard, but this seems like a really big win. Send in the next wave is a slightly expensive stratagem. It does cost 2 CP, and I guess that's quite a big deal in 10th edition when you're starting on 0. It means that you would actually likely need to save for this, and you literally wouldn't even be able to use it if your opponent gets first turn, unless Guard have got some other funky way of generating CP at the start of a battle round. It does look really quite fun though, and is very reminiscent of the Valhallan stratagem from the 8th edition Guard Codex. That one Games Workshop promptly broke with reinforcement points, so you couldn't really use it properly. This one looks like it's got absolutely no such restrictions though, and you'd hope not at 2 CP. But basically this one means that when a Guard unit dies, it can swiftly return to the table. You use it in any phase when one of your units with the regiment keyword is destroyed. They clarify a few potential targets, including infantry squads, Tempestus Scions, Sentinels, Field Ordnance, or heavy weapon squads. I'd guess probably not Auxilia, and almost certainly not armoured vehicles like Ross's, but still even targeting your standard infantry, this is going to be pretty big. When that unit is destroyed, you basically just get to regenerate it, put it into strategic reserves as if it were reinforcements all along, and then I guess at the next turn it will return to the board by the normal rules for strategic reserves, maybe tweaked in 10th edition, but moving on from the side of the board or your deployment zone in some way. If it turns up, then you don't get to regenerate any attached characters that were destroyed alongside it, but it does get to come at starting strength with all its wounds remaining. Looks like you can literally trade command points for fresh Guard units. Overall, as stratagems go, I am quite impressed by this one. It seems excellently reliable for just adding raw value to the army. Even just from the units previewed, that means that we could be getting 3 Sentinels back, 20 Guard shock troopers, or 2 of your field ordnance guns with some really big heavy las cannons. Sounds like it's typically going to be 2 CP spent for somewhere between 100 to 150 points worth of models returning to the table. Massively excellent value in terms of how much a CP can usually add. Definitely feels like one that could be a bit painful to save for, given that CP are so precious now. but still just the reward of literally more army turning up to help you out is pretty massive, I think. And as well as just getting raw more force to the board, you can make sure that it's the force that your opponent least wants to deal with. Say for example, if they're using a lot of armor and they gun down your heavy las cannons on the field ordnance battery earlier, then you can choose them as the target for this stratagem as opposed to something else that was good at dealing with infantry, and then hey presto, your anti-tank guns are restored the next turn, moving in from the board edge. Overall this does seem really quite cool. Doesn't sound like it's going to be the sort of thing that's too overtuned though, costing that many command points, unless Guard have some ridiculously easy way to farm them. It'll be interesting to see how well this one competes against the other stuff for the combined regiments. I feel like the other stratagems might have to be fairly strong to get a look in against this one. Next up, unlike quite a lot of the other armies, we've also got some enhancements previewed for the Imperial Guard. These being the new versions of relics and warlord traits combined into one kind of, and from what we know at the moment it just sounds like you get these free on up to 3 non-named special characters. No indication that you need to pay points or command points for them yet, and it might be quite relevant for Guard given that they usually tend to be an army where you can spam out quite a lot of non-named characters for quite cheap. Games Workshop described these in the free text so we don't have the entirety of the rules, but in particular that Drill Commander one looks pretty useful to me. They said that it some way allows your stationary units to get critical hits on a 5+ rather than a 6+, which I think is going to be most relevant for Born Soldiers, given that that allows you to get the lethal hits on 5s not 6s, auto wounding on really quite a lot of your shots, provided you're static. They maybe were a little bit unclear as to just how easy that is to hand out and what sort of units it can be given to. I think my first guess would probably be just to the units that the leader attaches to, though if it's an aura it would be great. Even so though, if it's a free upgrade then it seems pretty nice for a character maybe chilling with some mortars or something, if that sort of thing does wind up being efficient. A full mortar team auto wounding on a 5+ does sound quite fun. It wouldn't have much AP but it would definitely stack some saves. The other one, I must admit, sounds a little bit on the weaker side, the Death Mask of Alanius. It might be that they haven't previewed the entire rule and maybe it still gives an invul save of some sort, but the only thing that they mentioned was that it means that the objective control characteristic doesn't drop to 0 when battle shocked, it still remains 1. My first reaction to that was that it sounds a little bit underwhelming. I guess the idea would be to put it on a character that then joins to something like a big squad of Cadians or something. You could have 20 men on the objective, and then this basically guarantees that they're still going to be holding the objective at least, even if they get battle shocked, which it sounds like quite a lot of units have some sort of way of handing those tests out, even if they don't just do it by raw casualties. Again, as a free upgrade, I guess it seems fine enough for a squad that's advancing into the midfield. Maybe does just feel a little bit like planning for the worst though, kind of banking on the units being injured but not actually destroyed, and then also failing battle shock, which doesn't feel like it should happen every game. And maybe you might just be better off buying in a commissar or something. Still though, if it does wind up being a free upgrade, it seems handy enough to have on a unit going forward with a character. Lastly, we've got a couple of datasheets previewed, and again they show us some pretty interesting stuff. First up, we've got the new profile for the Cadian shock troops. We've got both the unit construction and the weapon profile pages for these guys. Unit construction definitely is interesting though, as they've been altered to having squad size of either 10 or 20. This one does answer a question for me for how they were going to handle the battle line restrictions, which actually looked like they could be pretty restrictive for the Guard. You can now have only up to 6 units of each battle line unit, and for Guard if you wanted to play all Cadian shock troops that would mean only 60 of them, certainly a bit less than at least a fair few armies tended to field. Now though, I guess you can have proper Horde style Guard units, really big units to make efficient use of leaders, orders, and stratagems I suppose, though I guess it would come with the downside of making them very vulnerable to blast weapons. When the squad's at max size I guess that would be a massive +4 shots to every blast weapon targeted at them. They did confirm that it's the same for all the other infantry variants as well, Death Corps of Krieg and Kaschan Jungle Fighters and the regular infantry squad, which still seems to be a thing thankfully. Means that if you're willing to mix and match a few datasheets, it shouldn't be too hard to have a full army of loads and loads of infantry should you want it. I guess you can have up to 120 models of each of them. Otherwise, for the unit construction page, you can also have 2 leaders in the unit, I guess to represent things like a commissar plus a castellan. It's also kind of interesting that they mentioned the command squad in this one, so it sounds like you could have a truly massive Imperial Guard infantry unit with 2 Cadian shock troops plus a command squad all in the same squad, a massive horde of guardsmen with a command section. The options that they can take are kind of similar to previous. You've still got things like the drum-fed auto gun on the sergeant. It seems that they can't take sniper rifles. I guess that war gear will be locked to the standard infantry unit now. Finally, a bunch of the keywords are interesting enough. They are battle line as expected, They have the grenades keyword, which is going to be a core stratagem, probably for some sort of damage output, we don't know yet. They've got the regiment keyword, which would allow them to regenerate with that stratagem. I'd guess it might be useful for other things as well, maybe things like what characters can join the unit. They've got the platoon keyword, Cadian keyword as well, but the Cadian keyword isn't in the faction keyword section, so it doesn't sound like including these would lock you out of taking Catachan jungle fighters. Seems that sort of situation is staying the same for the Guard. Moving on to their unit profile, their base stats aren't enormously changed. It does seem that they get objective control too, which will be quite a big advantage compared with armies that can't field quite as big hordes. You could be getting a whole load of objective control points on a marker. They are leadership 7+ as well, which means they'd be failing battle shock 42% of the time. Really quite uncertain if they do get below half strength. Otherwise, I'd say perhaps the most interesting thing about this datasheet is all the weapon previews that we get. Lasguns seem to be remaining the same as they ever were, a nice baseline for small arms in 40k I guess. Plasma guns have lost a pip of AP if they're not overcharging now, though I feel like they're going to be very interesting with that new first rank, second rank order, getting double shots out to max range and 3 shots at half range. I suppose that will be extra hazardous for losing the model. Perhaps the single biggest news out of the entire thing is that the grenade launcher has been spectacularly buffed. These things have been kind of awful compared with the other special weapons for quite a while now. It looks like the frag profile is only D3 shots, but at strength 4 AP 0 now. That's not really the exciting bit though. The main value for that one now looks like it comes from the crack grenade, which has gone up to a massive strength 9, AP -2 and damage D3. I really wasn't expecting that kind of change when it was previously strength 6 and AP 1. Maybe they've done this so it just actually balances out a little bit against things like the plasma and melter gun. Kind of hilarious that it now has the same strength characteristic as a melter gun does. I guess with that range it might be enough for people to take them alongside plasma guns, as opposed to just sticking with the tried and tested plasma and melter. The auto gun is a simple 2 shots out to 24-inch range, no assault keyword or anything like that. The Voxcaster is kind of interesting, as it now gives you a chance to refund CP if you spend a stratagem on this unit. You get to refund 1 command point on a 5+ if you spend a stratagem on them, or it goes up to a 4+ if there's an officer just nearby. That's kind of an interesting change, to be honest. It might mean that spending stratagems on your baseline infantry is a lot less of a bad idea than it was before. Though I guess if Kazakin and Scions are still getting Voxcasters like this, it probably means that they're still going to be better targets. From my first reading of this rule, it looks like this one would work on the reinforcement stratagem, even if they're off the board. I think that even if they had an officer nearby them when they died though, it would still be a 5+, as they're off the board when the stratagem is used. Finally, they've got a new version of their Shocks Troops special rule. This one now no longer gives them exploding 6s to hit with their lasguns. Instead they pick up the Sticky Objectives type rule, the one that Space Marines have gained in 9th edition. It's basically the one where if you hold an objective with this unit in your command phase, that objective will remain yours for the rest of the battle unless your opponent takes it at some point. It's kind of like the shock troops plant a flag in an objective and they can go off to keep on pressing the foe without having to stand on it. It's helpful enough, I suppose, if it does make more sense to counter-attack the enemy. I can't help but think though a lot of the time it is just going to be better to sit on that objective anyway and put all their objective control there, just as a ward against your opponent going and taking it off you with one small fast moving unit. Overall definitely looks like an interesting enough datasheet to me. Kind of cool that we can field big 20-man guard squads once more. I feel like that could be pretty fun depending on what the characters give them. Really quite cool to see the grenade launcher hitting that hard as well. I feel like they've been kind of useless for far too long. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the mighty Baneblade. This one really has been redesigned as a mobile fortress, keeping the stats of being very hard to kill, and now also having a really interesting special rule where it provides cover to nearby guard units. Its stat line has gone up to a big toughness 13 with a 2+ save and then 24 wounds. Toughness 13 maybe feels in a sort of similar place to the toughness 9 that it was before. Against some things though it arguably seems better. Things like vehicle mounted las cannons that seem to have been strength 12 so far will be wounding this thing on a 5+, not really all that effective. I'd say perhaps the most interesting rule on the datasheet though is maybe that Rolling Fortress special rule. This one now means that your Baneblade can sort of provide mobile castle defense to nearby guard. If you've got guard models trailing in the wake of the mighty beast, if the enemy can't 100% see that model and partly because of the Baneblade, your model will then get the benefit of cover. That could be really big on other units that get a 2+ save. Seems like it could be very nice to have maybe a pair of Russes follow up the Baneblade, one on either side, with the Baneblade spearheading the way. Or it sounds like you could potentially take the cheapest Baneblade chassis variant and have it shield for another bigger one. Perhaps have a regular Baneblade shield for a Shadow Sword or something like that. I think it sounds fun at least. Might not necessarily always be super meaningful, the opponent might just be happy to gun down the Baneblade as best they can, but I feel like with the amount of guns that just aren't going to be particularly effective into the Baneblade, that might not be the worst thing. Otherwise, the datasheet gives us a whole ton of previews about various interesting weapons. It does look like autocannons are going to be following that Strength 9 profile that we saw for the Space Marines. The coaxial one gets 2 shots at Strength 9, AP 1 and Damage 3. Fairly punchy against light armor now, I suppose. The last cannon seems to be the same one that's mounted on the Ballistus Dreadnought. A base strength of 12, AP 3 and damage D6 plus 1 looks like that's the standard profile, at least for vehicle mounted ones now. And heavy stubbers look like they've received a little bit of an interesting upgrade. They now get 3 shots at max range but are rapid fire 3, so we'll get quite a big 6 shots at 18-inch range, quite a lot of anti-infantry there. It looks like they're just flatly superior to Stormbolters now if you get the choice between the two. I'd guess that might mean that the stubber might cost a few more points. The mighty Baneblade cannon has lost a little bit of AP. It's 3d6 shots at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3 now. Still very nice and general purpose, though unlike that Shadow Sword's Volcano Cannon, it looks like it's not a heavy weapon, so it only gets to hit on a 4+, not a 3. Overall it is a little bit less damage than it was before, again seeming to be the trend in 10th. If anything though, the Demolisher Cannon I feel like it got a bit of a buff. The Baneblade variant only had d6 shots before, but now it's d6 plus 3, and they're going off at strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6. Really quite a nice, generally threatening profile. Looks like maybe it's lost a bit of damage on its main Baneblade cannon, but that's been shifted to the Demolisher. I think given that profile, there's a pretty reasonable chance that that's going to be the profile that's available on the standard Lehman Russ now. If so, then that just seems miles better than the standard battle cannon. Jumping from AP1 to AP3 and all the way up to strength 14 really means that it's going to be an all-rounder. I feel like that's the sort of upgrade that I'd be very happy to eat the change in range for. Otherwise, for Baneblade things, looks like it's got a huge explosion if it blows up. Battle shock tests still are going to be on a 7+, so even the guard armor is going to be easy to get battle shocks. Might actually be surprisingly bad if that winds up in combat. And it degrades at 1/3 wounds and loses objective control as it does, as well as the -1 to hit penalty. Looks like that's going to be the standard for super heavies now. We did see it with the Necron Monolith. It does look like from this datasheet that there's no obvious turret weapon rule on it. Don't know if that's just gone entirely. I suppose it's not impossible we might see some sort of general change to vehicles in 10th edition, though GW haven't previewed anything of the sort yet. I feel like we would have heard about it by now if there'd been a major change like that. I guess as a Titanic vehicle, the Baneblade would probably still be able to fall back and shoot. Perhaps it's going to be more important to see whether or not that's the case on the standard Lehman Russ datasheets. Overall, that really was quite a chunky and interesting preview. I must admit a fair few of the rules perhaps do seem like downgrades from 9th, though I guess in 10th with damage output often going down across the board, plus the potential for entirely new points costs on everything, you can't really say from this whether guard are going to be strong or weak. I'd say for most interesting things, I feel like that grenade launcher profile is kind of cool, big 20-man guard squads sound fun, and I really like the idea of that send in the next wave style stratagem. Perhaps for disappointing things, I feel like the battle cannon is the biggest letdown for me. Even if the Russ does have some sort of generic rule to allow it to get better firepower somehow, I just can't really see it holding its own against the other guns with those kind of stats. I'd be amazed if something like the Vanquisher, Executioner or Demolisher isn't more of a way to go than that. Let me know your thoughts though. What do you make of all these guard changes, and how do you feel that the guard are shaping up for 10th edition? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. Well, I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Hopefully I'll try and cycle back and talk a bit more about either the Baneblade or the Shock Troops in a bit more detail in a future video. Should be fun to do a bit more analysis rather than just a quick read of the rules. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel and you'd like to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.